So hello everyone to the DynamicsCon conference. My name is Arend-Jan Kauffmann, and I welcome you to this session. Thank you so much for voting this session. I hope to give you some ideas about creating custom APIs, some insights, some tips and tricks. I thank the DynamicsCon conference committee for organizing this, and I hope you all have a great conference. So my name is again Arend-Jan Kauffmann. I'm a freelance technical consultant and trainer, and also an MVP for Business Central. Yeah, and I think I have done quite some things around API. So let's see what I can share, and if you can learn something from it. You can post all your questions in the chat. I will be there. I will be waiting for you at the end of the session in a live chat to answer your questions. So feel free to shoot anything you have in the chat. Let's get started. These are the topics I want to cover in this session. Actually, I could think of a lot more, but yeah, we have to stick to the time we have for this session, of course. So we're going to walk you through the page properties that each API page needs. When you create custom APIs, I'm going to tell you something about field names, and more specifically also about field properties, because honestly I see some people are using some properties that are actually not necessary. I'm going to talk about page triggers more in detail, how every data operation, the inserts, the modify, delete, how they work, what the page triggers actually are doing, which page triggers are called, and in which order are they called, and what can you do with them. And then finally, I'm going to talk about nested pages and how you can work the best with that for header line scenarios, for example. So first of all, API page properties. You know, when you create a custom API, you have to specify a number of properties that are mandatory. And these properties are here on this screen and on the next slide. And we start with the API publisher. I always start with the API publisher as the first property, because that one is also the first that is used in a URL. So if I use API publisher, then API group, and then API version in that order in the API page, as you can see in the screenshot on the right hand side, then you can actually also read the URL already from that point. So the API publisher is part of the URL, and it's usually the company that creates the API, the company that publishes the API. In this example, I've chosen Cronus, but it could be an ISV name, it could be the company name who's running Business Central. And this one is actually an important one, because there cannot be two apps that publish with the same publisher group version combination. So usually you have to pick a good name and stick with that name. There's nothing you can reserve from Microsoft, so make sure you pick one that nobody else is using. That name, the API publisher name, is case insensitive. That means that you can use any casing in the URL, you can use all lowercase, that's all fine. API group is also part of the URL, the second part in the URL after the API publisher, and that one is also case insensitive, and that can be used to divide groups of APIs in multiple groups, like maybe finance or sales, or maybe just have one big group and call it data, as I've done here in the example. The next one is API version, and that is actually not a mandatory property, but it is recommended to always have it there. If you do not specify API version, it's going to be beta. So that's an implicit API version, you could say. But you better just put it into the API page and specify it as beta or in the v(x.y) format. So it's going to be v1.0 or v1.1 or v2.0, whatever, but it must be in that format or the word beta. Now the API version, that can be multiple. You can have one API sitting in multiple versions, and that allows you to create new versions of your APIs, but not having to copy all the individual API files. You only have to update those files that are really having a change in the version, in the new version, and all others that remain the same, just get that extra API version to the list. That makes it more flexible for you for maintainability. Then we have the entity set name, and that is actually the name of the collection of entities. It's a plural name. It's well, actually the whole collection, and that one is case sensitive, and it is recommended to use camel casing. If you have the incorrect casing in the URL, it's not going to work. So make sure to either choose correct casing, like camel casing, or maybe all lowercase, that's up to you. But it is a case sensitive name. So those four properties, publisher, API group, API version, and entity set name, all of them, they are part of the URL. Then we also have something that's called entity name. And the entity name is actually the singular entity name, where the entity set name is the plural name. Now the entity name itself is not used in a URL. Instead, you can find it in the metadata. There you can read what an entity is and what the properties are of that single entity. Also recommended to use camel casing in the same way as you use for the entity set name. Then we have a property delayed insert. If you create an API page, VS Code is going to complain that you need to specify delayed insert unless you set the editable property to false. In that case, there is of course no insert possible, so delayed insert is not necessary. But otherwise, if an API is editable, then you must have delayed insert set to true. And that's because all the fields will be validated before a record is inserted, or modified for that matter. So that is the behavior of all API pages, and it is a mandatory property. Then we have the OData key fields, and that property defines what field will be used for the identifier value. So if you have a URL and you use the entity set name, and then between brackets you have an ID, that ID is mapped to the field that you specify as the OData key field. It's, by the way, not mandatory, but highly recommended to always specify the OData key field, and it's also recommended to use the system ID field for that, because that is a field that is immutable. It cannot change. It will stay the same for the whole life cycle of a record. So whatever happens to a primary key, it does not change the system ID, and that means that external systems always can track a record, a single record, based on their system ID. They can trust that that one will be the same always. So these are the standard properties that you have to specify on every API page, and this is also what I do, always in this order: publisher, group, version, entity set name, and an entity name, and then, well, delayed insert, source table, and the OData key fields. There are other properties that you can specify as well, which is the captions. But I will come to captions on next slide more specifically. We have fields on those pages, and this is the part of you see the screenshot is a part of a customer API, and I want to point out some things about the fields here. First of all, names of the fields, they should be in camel casing. Actually, those fields are the ones that you see in the JSON. So sell to customer name, postal code, phone number, you see the examples there. You see the examples on the screen shot on the right side. you should go with a camel casing, although Pascal casing works. It's just common use in web services world to have camel casing. Now at least you should always include the system ID and a system modified at. If you have the OData key field system ID and you do not provide the system ID in the page, that does not really make sense. So you get a warning if you specify system ID as the OData key field and you did not put it on the page. VS Code is going to warn you about that and say, hey, you forgot that one, please add it. And so that's something you should do. Always go with system ID. You see that at the first field here on the screen, and the last field you see on the screenshot is the system modified at. That is what is called an audit field. It's maintained by the system, by the platform. It will always have the timestamp of the latest modification of that record, and that can actually be used for filtering records that have been modified, so let's say a timestamp, and it's also used for webhook functionality. So you must make sure to have that included, ID field and the system modified at field. Now in Business Central APIs there is some naming going on. The standard APIs from Microsoft, they are using standard naming. For example, the system ID field is not called system ID in the output. In a JSON payload they call it ID. Same goes for the field number. A field name that is widely used in Business Central, but yeah, the JSON does not work with those quotation marks, does not work with the dots. So what you get is the word no. But, no means nothing, negative, false. So having a field, a key with the name no is actually something you don't want. So instead you should go with the word number, the name number for your no field. Also, thing that Microsoft is doing in their standard APIs is not using a field with the name, but instead give it the name display name. Yeah, that's up to you, of course. You can go with name, but you can also follow the standard API rules that Microsoft is using themselves at the API pages. So yeah, display name is a good one. Actually, Microsoft is also using display name for description fields. Yeah, you could just go with description, of course. That's up to you in your API pages. The system modified at field is usually called last modified datetime. That is the same as with the standard APIs. I recommend to go with the same name. So do not use modified at, but just go with last modified datetime. Now you see in the screenshot that I'm not using properties like application area or caption. Application area is not applicable to APIs. This is not a UI page, so there are no application areas. So you do not need application area. It does work without application areas. No reason to specify it. Same goes with caption. I see a lot of API pages specifying caption on all fields. Well, the same as normal UI pages. If you do not specify a caption in the page, it takes the caption from the table. So yeah, if you just can use the caption from the table, then why would you specify the caption in the API page? I mean, you have to maintain the translations as well. Another reason to not use captions is how would your API be used? If your API is going to be used by an external system that is not using any UI, it's not going to present something to a user, but it's just for system-to-system integration, then caption is actually a little bit overload. So the external system is never going to read captions anyway. But yeah, if you need it because there will be some UI at the other side that needs to be presented to a user, yeah, you can specify captions and then you can read the captions from what is called the system definition. And let me show you quickly how that looks like. I do have Postman over here, and I'm gonna call the entity definitions endpoint. So I do have an API here, Cronus demo 3.1. So here you see, by the way, the a publisher, the group and the version, and there I have entity definitions, and here you see an entity name called demo headers. This is the table, you will see that later in the demo, and we see automatically a field ID, which is actually the system ID, and all kind of translations automatically for that field. They're coming from the system. So I did not specify that in the API page, I just specified them in, they are automatically specified. So here I have, for example, field 2, it does have a caption. I have a field 3 with a caption, all coming from the table and not specified in the API page itself. So yeah, the captions are taken from the table by default, just like any normal UI page. So no application error, no caption unless it's required. That makes your API page also clean, I would say. That you see on the screenshot, used to have them, all those fields on one line instead of multiple lines. That is how I like to write the API pages. Then something about the page triggers. I see people struggling with that, so I thought, well, let's figure out how exactly do the page triggers play a role in APIs. Because every data operation, read, insert, modify, delete, they do have a different flow, and the page triggers, they work slightly different from what you are used to in UI pages. So two triggers that you will see always being executed is the onInit trigger and the onOpen page trigger. So whatever you do, a get, post, a patch or delete, you will always see the onInit and the onOpen page trigger. They will always be executed in the beginning of the code. I'm going to show you that also in a demo. Triggers that are never executed are the onQuery close page and the onClose page. Those two triggers are not executed for API pages. So that is something to keep in mind, because if you thought that, hey, let's take the onClose page to, let's say, do some final wrap up for the request, that's not going to work. Your onClose page code will just not be executed. Never, ever. So we have per different data operation, we have a different flow of triggers, and that is what I want to go into more detail. If you look at the get operation, the get operation is running the triggers onInit, then onOpen page, then the onFind record, and then for every record that it finds, it is running the onAfterGet record, onAfterGetCur record, and the onNext record. Now the onInit trigger is not so relevant for API pages. You could maybe set some global variables from there, but that's pretty much what you can do. And you have access to, no access to any filter whatsoever. Actually, the onInit in pages is for UI pages used to initialize the state of controls. So that is not something you do with API pages. So usually we do not write anything in the onInit trigger on API pages. The onOpen page, though, that is an interesting one, because in the onOpen page you can see what the filters are that you are using against that API page. So the filters that are specified on the URL. That's something you can work with. Maybe you say, hey, I want to check if there was a filter. I want to check if maybe you only support one or two filter types. I don't know. You can check here if the filters were set, if they were properly set, etc. You can maybe set extra filters, like filtering out certain records. And you can use the onOpen page trigger to initialize a temporary table. So if you have a table source temporary, you can use the onOpen page to run code that fills the temporary table that is the source table for the API page. Then the onFind record. Microsoft, in their standard APIs, they are using onFind record to do initialization of the temporary tables. that's also fine, of course. It's just an alternative to the unopened page. Unfind record is in the get operations only called one time, but you will see later in other operations it could be multiple times. And then for every record you see an on after get record, get current record and next record. So let me introduce you to my demo. I'm gonna just trying to read some headers because I'm gonna do some with lines also later. I'm just gonna send a request and I get some headers over here with some data. And I have created some code that logs all the triggers that are being executed for this request. So let me open that one and here we go. We see that the on init is called, the unopened page is called, and then we get on find record one time, and then for every single record on after get record, get current record, and then the next record all the way to the end. And the final one is on next record, where it figures that there's no record anymore to read, so there it quits. So there's no on close page or whatsoever. The on next record is actually the final, the last one that is executed. At this moment I did not use any trigger, or not use any filters. So let me throw in a filter here and then see what happens. So the first thing I'm gonna do is say, hey, give me just one single record. So one single record is now read from the database, and let me then open up this list again and do F5, and here we see the next one. So this is session number, let me just click on this one and say filter to this value. So that was the session ID, and here you see that my system ID is now currently the filter, and I only have an on init and an on open page. In the on open page I have the filter information, and then on find after get record, get current record, because there's just one record that he gets, and the on next record will just return false. There is nothing to find anymore. So here you see that it's actually filtering on the ID. So what happens if I did not do that, but uses a filter right here and say, hey, filter is going to be number equals, and let's check his value here and send it. It's gonna return the same one, and let's see what happens then over here. And now I need to clear this filter, go down, and we have the next session over here, and you see now that my filter was the number on header 00002. So in the unopened page trigger I do have access to all the filters that have been set on the URL, and that can definitely help me, of course, in finding out how was this page, how was it filtered, was there a filter. Some pages, for example in standard APIs of Microsoft, say, hey, you must specify a filter because otherwise the data set is going to be too big. Like on lines you always have to filter the document number, just as an example. So yeah, this is I think useful information in the code that we can use, especially when you have extra filters, or maybe you want to fill a temporary table, and you can then pass on the filters to some code that fills the temporary table. So that is for the get operation. Now let's look at an insert. That's a little bit different. There we do have an on init trigger, again not relevant for API pages. We do have the on open page where we will have access to the filters, but it does not work in subpages, and I'm gonna show you that later when I talk about the subpages. Then after the on open page we get the on new record. In the on new record we have the filters, as we do have an on open page in normal pages, and in subpages only in the on new record. So it's something to keep in mind, and again I'm going to show you that when we talk about the subpages. The on new record can be used to initialize fields. Why do you need that? I'm going to show you when we get to the subpages, because there it's getting useful to initialize extra fields. Then we get the onValidate trigger for every single field in the request body, but they are validated in the order as they are specified in the API page, not in the order as they are specified in the request body. Then after the onValidate of all the fields, we get finally the onInsertRecord trigger, which can be used to complete record with extra data, or maybe hand off the insertion of the data to a code unit that does all the hard work for us. So let me show you that in an example. Before I show you the example, I want you to show you the code that I have. I have a API page over here, and in the API page I have a field 2, a field 3, field 4, just in order as they are numbered. And in the request I'm going to use a different order as they are specified here, and for every field I use a write log, so I can see in my log which fields got first. So here is the request. I'm gonna create a new header record, and in the body I'm gonna use the order field 5, then field 2, and then field 8, and then field 7. And then I'm gonna create a new record. So here we got the new record created, and now let's look at the log file. Let's see what is going on there. Here we see the new session start with 1036, an on init, an on open page, an on new record, and then in order field 2, 5, 7, and 8, and then finally the on insert record. So not in the order as they appear in the body, but in the order as they appear in the API page. Now the on insert record trigger, that one is actually also returning the data to the as the response. So whatever we put into the record in the on insert trigger, that will also be visible to in the response. So in order to keep in mind, this is on new record, then on validate for every field, and then on insert record. There's no on get record, there is no on find, there is no get current record whatsoever. Then we have the patch operation. Well, that is quite a list of triggers that are executed, because a patch operation modifies an existing record. So it needs to find the existing record first before he can modify. And that is why we have more triggers than we have with the on insert, because it's just going to insert something. It does not have to read an existing record. So again, we have the on init, then we have the on open page. Again, can be used to read read records into a temporary table. The get filters just have the information on the record ID, that is the filter. Then we get the on find record, can also be used to fill the temporary table. Then the on after get record, get current record, then the next record, and then I don't know exactly why, but again we get the on after get record, get current record. So the on after get record is executed twice and not just one time. I don't know why, to be honest, but it happened. Then we get the onValidate for every field that was specified in the patch body and did actually have a different value. So fields that are specified in the patch operation in the body that are having exactly the same value as already in the database, those fields will not be validated. I'm going to show you that, of course. Then after the validate of all the fields, we get the onModify record, but you also can use to hand over to a code unit that does the hard stuff for us. And then after the onModify record, we get again the onAfterGet record and the getCur record. So that is different from the insert. You would say, hey, why doesn't it stop with the onModify like it does with the onInsert? Well, I don't know. It just gets the record again, probably because it reads the record again from the database based on the filter. So let me show you that with a patch command. I'm gonna take this value here and go to patch and change that one and then go to the body. And here I'm gonna say in this again in a different order, field 5 is gonna be true. Here field 5 was already true, so field 5 will not be validated. Field 2 is gonna have some patched value, while field 2 here has some value, so that one is actually modified. Field 8 has well, the same date timestamp as I was using here, and field 7 is going to be 13, and that was here 10. So in the end, actually I'm only going to change field 2 and field 7. Well, let me see what happens. Here we have the patch result, and let me refresh this one, and here we are with the next one on open page. This one has a filter, find record, get current. You see here the repeating thing after get and get current record. Then a validate for field 2 and 7. So field 5 and field 8 were specified in the request body but did not get validated because they are exactly the same value as already in the record in the database. Then we get the onModify record and again a get record and a get current record. So this is the order of triggers for a patch command. Then we have of course also a delete command, and a delete command is well a little close to the patch, as in there's the onAfterGet record and a get current record twice. And also of course the onInit, onOpen, onFind record, and then just the onDelete trigger, and that's it. So there's no get record after the delete, obviously, because the record was gone. So let me show you that one as well. Gonna delete something, and now I should be able to see that. Hold on here, and 5. And there is my onDelete record trigger with twice a get record before. So init, open, find, get record, get current record, next get cur, and then finally onDelete record. Okay, so that's about the page triggers and how they behave. And I think that is quite some information you need and you can work with when you create custom APIs. Then nested pages, yeah, used a lot actually in standard APIs. Is used to query related data like header lines. That's the one I would like to focus on. It can also be related master data like detailed information about a customer or item data. And a nested page is added to the API with a page part. And the page part of course needs to be linked to the header page, and you do that with the sub-page link property, just as you do it in the UI pages. Preferably it is linked with the system ID, just because, well, that system ID is also preferably the one you use in the URLs, so that is always available. And yeah, you could link on, for example, document number and line number. That also works. In older versions that didn't work, but I checked it again, and in current versions that work. But I still like to have the system ID as the real link between header and line tables. That means that your line table also must have that header ID as an extra field, not only the header number, but also an ID field that links to the system ID of the header. Something that we need to keep in mind, because we need to fill that field. We need to have that field somehow, and that means that we need to do an extra step to fill that one. I'm gonna show you how that works. The entity set name that you specify on the page part is the one that is used in the URL and in the JSON. In the URL, like $expand or just slash and then demo lines in this example. The name you give to the part is not used. So yeah, it's recommended to have the same name as the entity set name, but the entity set name property is actually the one that is exposed in the APIs. Now, that related page does not have to be an API page. It could be just a type page part, or just name it. It does not have to be an API page on its own, but it can be an API page. But if you want to have just a normal page part, that is also possible. The only difference would be that you cannot directly open that API page with a direct URL. You always have to go through the header. And I have some tips for nested pages. So before I go to that one, let me just show you how it looks like in the code. So here is the code of the demo line. So let's start with the demo header. I have my part over here, demo lines, and that demo line is an API page on its own, and it's linked by header ID and system ID. Now, what happens is when I go to Postman, let me first do that. I'm gonna get the lines. Let me first create a line. Let me create a new header, take that ID, and then I'm gonna create a new line. That's like this, and here I have a body just with a field. That's it. I'm gonna create the line on this header, and as you can see, I automatically have my header entry number filled. It was not on the URL. I have my header ID, that is the one that comes from the URL, and I have a line number automatically, and I create another one. I have line number 20, line number 30,000, etc. Some of the standard properties on pages, they work for API pages as well. I'm gonna back to my code and dive into that subpage thingy, and I'm gonna show you auto split key. That make sure that the line numbers are automatically created. Something that is pretty handy, of course. So we do not have to write any code for find last and then add 10,000 whatsoever. Auto split key just works. Another thing is this one here, populate all fields. And that is actually a very, very useful property. I'm gonna switch it off, and let's see what happens if I post this one here with populate all fields set to false. It takes only a few seconds to publish this one. As in, by the way, small tip, you see it's not opening a browser. That's because I switched that off in the launch.json. Here I set launch browser to false, because I'm not testing APIs in a browser. I'm going to test APIs in Postman. Okay, so let's see. Let's create another one here. And well, it takes a few seconds because the app just published. And now it says the demo header does not exist. Hey, so that populate thingy, that was doing something. Let me go down and for a moment here switch off this data and publish it again, and you're gonna see a difference. Published, send it again, and here we do not have a header ID anymore. And the header ID is not filled because the header ID is actually not my primary key. So my primary key field is not, primary key fields are filled automatically, but if I have a sub-page link, as I have here, based on a non-primary key field, it's not filled automatically. And that is what the populate all fields property does for us. That one is going to fill automatically all filtered fields that do not are not part of the primary key. So if I go back here and show you, then my header ID field is filled. So that is what populate does for us, and the only thing that I then need to do here in my on new record is get the demo header and take the number from the demo header, because that field is not filled automatically. Well, not for the first record, first line record. Subsequent line records are filled because of the auto split key, but yeah, this is something that I need to do in the on new record, get the header ID, and I do not have to read the filter because the populate all fields property is going to fill this header ID, so I can just take it from the header and fill the number field. So I have some tips for you for nested pages. The auto split key works, as you saw. The populate all fields updates the non-primary key fields with the filtered value. That is pretty useful. If you want to read filters, you do not have to work with a filter group. That is not used in API pages. So filter group 4, for example, for the subpage link, not needed in nested pages. Just go with the standard filter group 0. In the on-open page, in your nested page, the get filters will be empty, but in your on new record, you will find the values in get filters coming from the subpage link or any other filter that was on the URL. And you can then use the on new record to initialize fields as I just showed you. That's it. Thank you very much for watching. See you in the chat after the session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks again to DynamicsCon conference team to manage all of this.
Hello.
Hey. Well, no.
Oh, so AJ, I'm
Yes.
good. How are you?
I actually enjoyed the show.
You
Did I?
enjoyed your own show, but I can say I enjoyed your show as well. Much. Again, a lot of information. We did have quite a few questions as well.
Yeah, great.
And I tried to note them down here a little bit. So let's start with the first one. I'll probably mispronounce the name, but I'm just going to try. Balaji asked, I want to maintain the API logs from server-side too, and also wanted to know the health of the API. Please give suggestions on how to do that for Business Central.
Yeah, well, API logs, I can be pretty sure about that. There's just one word, telemetry, because everything is logged into telemetry, the API calls, the incoming API calls. So nothing in the server, but enable telemetry and you will find it there. It's pretty simple, straightforward.
So please promise me not every answer is going to be telemetry on all the other questions as well. I mean,
yeah. Well, if I don't have an answer, it's going to be telemetry.
Okay, good one. So next question was, please give some suggestions on how to define the API structure, SOAP or REST. Again, telemetry or no?
Yeah, so I not sure what the question exactly means, but if the question is you have to choose between SOAP or REST, then it should be REST. SOAP is on the way out. It's still there. You can still use it, but there are rumors that Microsoft's gonna abandon it. So yeah, I would not choose SOAP anymore. Always go with REST. And to be honest, I cannot really think about any scenario that you cannot do with REST and you need SOAP for it. So
okay, clear. Let's just use SOAP for what it's meant for, to wash, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Christian Lenz is asking where to look for good API naming rules for API newbies on top of what AJ you presented.
Well, I think this answer is gonna you're gonna like that answer, Waldo.
Yes, that's why I'm asking the question.
yeah, because that should be at the AL guidelines website, right? There is something in docs, but yeah, read the guidelines. How for the naming rules? Yeah, it should be the AL guidelines.dev. That's going to be your session, by the way, right? On Thursday.
It's not on APIs, but I will refer to APIs as well. Yes.
Great.
So, Balaji again, how to set the trigger for API synchronous mode or asynchronous?
APIs are synchronous. So, yeah, there's nothing asynchronous there. If you want to have something like asynchronous, you can only think about storing it in a buffer table and take it from there with a job queue or something. APIs are working synchronously.
Yeah. Camille, and you probably already read and prepared that question. So how does it work? How does it work with triggers when you hit paging? Is reading of the new page new call? Is that a new call? And does calling the open again? So yeah, basically, how does it work?
Well, I read a question and I was thinking about it and I thought, okay, that's going to be Camille thinking about breaking things. Yeah, I wish I had thought about that before. I have not a final answer, but I have to investigate one. It's a great question, actually. I didn't bother to do that during this session, but yeah, that's something I need to find out.
Let's keep it for the follow-up session on the next DynamicsCon.
For example.
Extra tips and tricks involving paging, right? Yeah. Jason Wilders, in regards to onModify, what if you want to call the onValidate for a field even though the value is not changing?
That could only be done with by code, because the platform is not going to do it for you. If that, and that is what I found out. If you define the value in the payload, but the value is exactly the same as it is in the database, then the validate is just not triggered. So if you really want to forcefully trigger the validate, you have to do it from code. Yeah, there's no other way around that. So yeah, I cannot.
We just got a 2-minute warning. Last question, one that is very important for me. We were joking a little bit in the chat about that last modified add. Can you maybe stress one time more, because in my opinion that is very important, what we were joking about?
Yes, so the thing is, with the last modified datetime, it must be that name because of the webhooks. In webhooks, you can get notifications of a collection saying, hey, there is a series of records that have been modified. And if you do not have last modified datetime, that is not working as expected. So let's say it like that. So if you want to have want to have a URL that has the last modified date time in the URL in your notification for a collection of change records, you must have that field with that name. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's hard.
We need to wrap up. Thank you, AJ, for this informative session once again.
Okay, I tried to answer some questions in the chat, and then thanks and enjoy the rest of the conference.